We were four guys that I met Paul and said, "Do you want to join my band?" And then George joined, and then Ringo joined. We were just a band who made it very, very big. That's all.
Hello and welcome to Beatles Storytime, where I shall attempt to break down the series of events that led from them being a skiffle group called the Quarrymen to being signed as the Beatles by EMI in 1962. Throughout this set of videos, I will be questioning the official narrative to see if it holds water. In this video, I shall be looking at the following question. How did the Beatles get invited to play in the clubs of Hamburg? We shall start in January 1960. Stuart Sutcliffe had just joined the Beatles due to the persistent cajoling of John Lennon. They were friends from art school in Liverpool. The problem was that Stuart had no particular desire to have a career in music, and he didn't own or play an instrument. Between the 17th of November 1959 and the 17th of January 1960, Stuart's artwork was displayed as part of the John Moores exhibition at the illustrious Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. In fact, John Moores liked Stuart's painting so much that at the end of the exhibition he bought it himself for £65. This was a small fortune to an impoverished art student, the equivalent of £1,245 in 2023. Rather than investing the money back into his art career, John Lennon persuaded Stuart Sutcliffe to buy a President Hofner bass and join his band instead. This meant that the Beatles, who were actually still known as the Quarrymen at this point, were now a lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, with all three playing guitar, and Stuart Sutcliffe on bass. Crucially, they had no drummer, and they automatically had little chance of being hired for any gigs without one. They spent a fair bit of their time at the Jacaranda coffee bar, whilst trying to make one coffee last for 2 hours. The Jacaranda was run by the 29-year-old Alan Williams, a short and stocky man and a thorough opportunist. From May 1960 to April 1961, he was the quasi-manager for the Beatles and booked many of their gigs. During the week of the 14th to the 20th of March 1960, Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent headlined a pop package show at the Liverpool Empire, promoted by Britain's then great pop impresario Larry Parnes. It was a huge success, and in the words of Alan Williams, he could smell money, lots of it. After these shows, Alan Williams telephoned Parnes to organise a jointly promoted one-night show at Liverpool Stadium, featuring Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent, accompanied by a laundry list of local acts. The tickets sell well, but then disaster strikes on the 17th of April 1960. Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent are involved in a car crash, in which Eddie Cochran dies and Gene Vincent is badly injured. Their Liverpool concert was just 16 days away. Rather than cancelling the show, and after receiving the information that Vincent had recovered enough to perform, Williams and Parnes pad out the show even further with more local acts. In the audience of this one-night event are the Beatles, who were not included in this show because, at this point, they were unknown to the promoters as musicians, although Williams had once employed the group to decorate the Jacaranda. Playing lead guitar for Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent at this time was Tony Sheridan. Tony would be the man that the Beatles, and especially George, would call teacher during their time in Hamburg. Tony's backstory is utterly fascinating and worthy of its own video, so I will leave the details until then. For now, let's just say that I believe Tony Sheridan was the prototype figure for John Lennon. The amount of parallel events between their early lives is simply stunning, and their meeting up in Hamburg feels completely contrived. It's also worth noting at this point that Tony Sheridan was also due to be in the same car as Cochrane and Vincent. He missed that ride due to being passed out from a heavy whiskey drinking session the night before. This is especially curious when we consider that Tony didn't normally drink whiskey, and the spirit hit him harder than he had expected. My suspicious mind can't help but wonder if the car crash was engineered and Tony was kept deliberately out of harm's way by someone getting him heavily drunk the night before. Tony himself was sent to Hamburg in June of 1960, and he was already noted for his ability as a music teacher. I think he was predestined to help the Beatles when they too left for Hamburg later that same year. But more about this whole subject in another video. After the show at the Liverpool Stadium, Parnes was impressed with the great well of local talent in the Merseyside area. He and Williams hold an audition to find backing bands for the solo singers that Parnes promoted. In particular, he needed a band to go on a nationwide tour with Billy Fury. John Lennon asked Alan Williams if he would help them find a drummer, which he did, in the form of Tommy Moore, sometime around the 5th of May 1960. 5 days later, on the 10th of May, the Beatles take part in the Parnes-Williams audition at the location that was to become the Blue Angel nightclub, recently purchased by Williams. Many acts take part, with each band located a 10-minute slot to make their mark. Tommy Moore misses the first half of the Beatles slot, whilst struggling to retrieve his drum kit from another venue across town. Meanwhile, Johnny Hutchinson, from the band Cass and the Casanovas, takes pity on them and fills in until Tommy Moore shows up. It was not a good first impression, but some versions of the event even describe an offer made to the Beatles by Larry Parnes that he would find them work if they dropped their new and floundering bassist, Stuart. We are told that, out of loyalty, they stuck together and refused the offer. Larry Parnes refuted this version of events, however, so what really happened is a mystery. The Beatles, now actually known as the Silver Beatles, were still eventually offered to back another singer from the Parnes stable called Johnny Gentle. They were hired for a 9-day tour in northeast England and Scotland at the end of May 1960, at a rate of £18 per man per week. The chief reasons why they got the gig is because A. No one else wanted the job due to all other bands having prior commitments, and B. Because the Beatles all dropped all of their own educational and work commitments, even going so far as to not show up to the one gig they did actually have lined up in order to make themselves available. Basically, they moved mountains in order to get the job. The tour is awful in most respects, but it was their longest paying set of gigs to date. Under-rehearsed, looking dishevelled, and not realising they wouldn't actually get paid until the end of the tour, they end up sleeping in their own van because they are too poor for a hotel, and sometimes even just the cost of a meal. Nevertheless, it was the start of their boot camp training into the world of professional rock and roll. Reflecting on this set of events, I cannot help but wonder if this was the first of many tests for the Beatles by the occulted cabal to see how well the band was developing. Upon their return, the Beatles played some ballroom gigs, booked by Alan Williams, and also at the Jacaranda on Monday nights with the house band, the 4-man Royal Caribbean Steel Band, had their night off. In June of 1960, Tommy Moore quit drumming for the Beatles under the duress of his long-suffering girlfriend. This made playing their ballroom gigs extremely difficult. The other members of the band still turn up for a gig, and John Lennon jokingly asked the audience of Teddy Boys if someone from the crowd wants to play drums with them. Taking him at his word, a gang leader called Ronnie climbed up onto the stage and demanded to play with them from that point onwards, despite having never played before. A desperate call from John to Alan Williams in the interval was required to evacuate them and their hired drum kit out of the building. By July 1960, Williams had opened an illegal strip joint and had the Beatles playing there. This turned out to be a not-so-wise union, because some of the strippers were used to playing with classically trained musicians who could read their sheet music. As a result, the Beatles could not play the music requested, and instead played old standards like the Harry Lime theme, Summertime, September Song, It's a Long Way to Tipperary, and Begin the Begin. The strippers were not impressed. Soon after the strip club debacle, the Beatles briefly gain another drummer in the form of Norman Chapman, who was easily the best drummer they'd had so far. Sadly, he only actually got to play about 3 times with the band, because he was conscripted into 2 years' national service in Kenya and Kuwait. At this point, we have to wonder how the Beatles managed to avoid doing national service themselves. National service in the UK was gradually phased out between 1957 and 1963. The birthday cut-off date was the 1st of October 1939, meaning all of the Beatles, who were born between 1940 and 1943, missed that deadline. Whether the law was changed in order to aid the Beatles and other bands who featured in the soon-to-becoming counterculture movement, or simply because everyone felt national service was no longer necessary, with memories of war being pushed into the past, is unknown. Either way, it meant the Beatles once again got very lucky. Back in the June of 1960, we are told that the Royal Caribbean Steel Band that played for Alan Williams were lured away to Hamburg when a West German businessman came into his club and offered to double their pay. It is astounding that no one seems to know who this person was. We know every other minute detail about the official Beatles narrative, but we don't know the name of the person who steals Alan Williams' house band and takes them back to Hamburg. A band who then guilelessly write back to him to say they're having a fine time in Hamburg, and he should come over and check out the club scene for himself. The importance of these events cannot be overstated, because this is what led Alan Williams to take them up on their advice and go to Hamburg, where he stumbled into the Kaiserkeller, owned by Bruno Koschmider. This whole part of the Beatles' official narrative feels entirely contrived, especially because Williams doesn't seem to have been particularly irate at having his house band stolen from him by a random German guy. Next, we get the story that Williams took the precaution of coming over to West Germany with a set of reel-to-reel tape recordings of the bands that he promoted. But when he goes to play those tapes to Koschmider, they are all demagnetized gibberish. Williams then returns to Liverpool with his hopes of importing his bands to Hamburg in tatters. But no matter, this is a fairy tale and it has a happy ending. Rather than being deeply unimpressed by Alan Williams's unprofessional display, Bruno Koschmider goes to England a couple of weeks later to find him, except that he has no idea where to find him because they did not exchange contact details, not even names and addresses. So Bruno Koschmider flies to London in 1960, when such an act is quite expensive, in the vague hope of meeting a man that he doesn't know at the wrong end of the country, with little knowledge of English, and rather than taking a translator with him, he chooses to rely on random strangers to translate for him. Because obviously, this is how professional businessmen conduct their business. But don't worry, because Bruno gets amazingly lucky. On the 24th of July 1960, he goes to the Two Eyes coffee bar in Soho, London, on the exact same day that Alan Williams just happens to be there, despite the fact that that bar is over 200 miles away from his home and businesses. So why was Williams there? He was there because Larry Parnes had promised Alan Williams that he would provide a couple of his acts some summer season work. The members of Derry and the Seniors had all quit their day jobs to be available for this work. Then, out of the blue, Parnes called up Williams and cancelled the engagements for no reason. This meant that Derry and the seniors were out of work, and their saxophonist, Howie Casey, was threatening physical violence if Williams didn't come up with new employment for them immediately. Alan Williams was friends with Tommy Littlewood, the owner of the Two Eyes Coffee Bar, and he was one of the few people that he could think of that would be able to supply sufficient short-notice work for Derry and the seniors. So Williams packed them all in his van, drove them from one end of the country to the other, and got them temporary work at the Two Eyes Coffee Bar, all just in time to run into Bruno Koschmider. Upon meeting up with Bruno, he offers work to Derry and the seniors in Hamburg at his clubs at good rates of pay, 30 Deutschmarks per man per night. A week later, on the 31st of July, Derry and the seniors were playing at the Kaiserkeller. Just 2 days later, Bruno Koschmider writes to Alan Williams to say that business is booming and he wants to open another club called the Indra. This would require more musicians to play at the venue, and so Koschmider requests that Williams sends over another band. Williams is delighted at the news, but cannot think of who to send. He considers Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Cass and the Casanovas, Jerry and the Pacemakers, but all of them were already employed for various gigs across the UK. Reluctantly, then, he turns to the drummerless Beatles, with the proviso that they must find a drummer in order to go to Hamburg. Williams writes a courtesy letter to Derry and the seniors to explain that the Beatles will soon be joining them. They waste no time whatsoever replying to his letter with a howl of protest, adding that it would spoil the scene for everyone to send such a bum group to Hamburg. In recent interviews with Howie Casey, he stood by this assessment of the Beatles, stating that, and I quote, "When the Beatles arrived in Hamburg, they were a mediocre group. By the time they left, they had improved 200%. Meanwhile, on the 6th of August 1960, the Beatles have their Saturday night ballroom gigs cancelled by the Wallasey Corporation, who finally bowed to the protests of local residents who were concerned with the deplorable noise and hooliganism that the venue attracted. With the loss of where to play, the Beatles go to the Cass Coffee Bar that they haven't been to in some time. They find the place thriving, and a quartet called the Blackjacks in residence. The drummer for the Blackjacks was Pete Best, the son of the Cass Coffee Bar's owner, Mona Best. Pete wanted to have a career as a professional drummer, but realised that his future path probably didn't lay with the Blackjacks, as they were actually on the verge of disbanding. Because of this, the Beatles offered the soon-to-be unemployed Pete the job of drummer in their band, with the understanding that they were all soon to depart to Hamburg. They give Pete an audition on the 12th of August, which was really a redundant act, because they couldn't go to Hamburg without a drummer, and they desperately wanted to go. So Pete was in the band, and by the 16th of August 1960, the Beatles were on their way to Hamburg by road and sea. And if you believe all of the above, then I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. It makes me wonder why the cabal went to such lengths to use their invisible guiding hand to direct the future of the Beatles. In the early 60s, most acts were of the someone and the somethings model. Clearly, Paul McCartney was important to the occulted cabal because they believed he was the reincarnated Egyptian god Osiris. Therefore, it was important to raise his star publicly. They could have done this so much more easily by making him a solo artist and providing him with an excellent backing band, but they didn't. They pursued a radically different business model for the time, one in which each band member was more or less of equal value, and the band became greater than the sum of its parts. It was also a model which appeared to be self-propelling. The bands of the future would write their own music and play on their own albums, or at least that's how it would appear to the public. the Beatles were part of a much bigger agenda. Yes, Paul was important for occulted reasons, but I suspect that this cause only motivated a select few at the time. The rest of the cabal just wanted social change, in the form of the 1960s counterculture movement. Where their mutual interests overlapped, I'm sure they had no problem helping each other out. And that's the end of this video. Next time I shall talk about Tony Sheridan's backstory, his relationship with the Beatles in Hamburg, and the recordings they made together. Until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.